Welcome back to the Mina Kimes Show featuring Lenny, the only NFL podcast. One of the hosts thinks if you run a sit route, you should get a treat. That's Lenny. He sits like a champ. Speaking of champs, we are joined by my friend, frequent guest, fresh off of his first draft as ESPN draft analyst on the ABC podcast. He was on NFL Live. He has been working nonstop, which is why it is so kind of him to join us this week. Field Yates, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back. It was such an honor to be with you all last week in Detroit. I love seeing the NFL Live family together. I know that's a rather infrequent occurrence just because of where everybody lives and the reality of the NFL calendar and the world we live in, but it was awesome. The energy was so great in Detroit, and it was cool to see. The day three stuff is kind of the thing that as a draft analyst you live for. So it was cool to see those moments on day three where players that may end up having no descript NFL moments get their moment, at least for a few minutes in Detroit on Saturday afternoon.
We're going to hit some day three picks today because the premise that I extended to you, we're doing two things on today's pod. Talked about some winners and not so winners on early in the week on Monday. You guys can check that out if you haven't already. But there's a lot of other really interesting picks I wanted to get to on teams that I didn't get into. So I asked you to send me 5 picks you loved across the draft. So not just in the first round. Yeah. I came up with 5 picks I loved. So this will allow us to get into some of the teams that I didn't get to on Monday. And then in the second half of the show, we're going to talk about teams that didn't draft rookie quarterbacks, but had, shall we say, holes on their offensive rosters. And the question is, did they do enough? So this is teams like the Giants, the Chargers. I did talk about the Chargers on Monday, but point is, there's a few teams we're going to get to. The Panthers is a big one. I think we'll hit that first. So I'm really excited today to get into all this stuff. And we're going to start with picks we loved. Yeah. I figure we can go back and forth and sort of go with the top of the draft and move our way down. You picked a player before mine, but I'm going to go first.
Go for it.
Because didn't talk about this team at all. Actually, we're going to talk about them later. And did they do enough? The New York Jets at pick 11, taking Olu Fashanu. Yeah. So, Field, I feel like almost not every, but a lot of draft analysts, people I had on my show, on NFL Live, we all kind of had the same party line going into the draft, which was they really should take an offensive tackle, but they're not going to eat their vegetables. They're going to take Brock Bowers if he's there. I really thought that's how it would play out. And Odunze goes 9, 10. The Jets are up. Oh, pardon me. The Jets traded.
Moved back one spot.
Moved back 11. So, but effectively, the Vikings took McCarthy, but they're at 11. Brock Bowers is there. I'm convinced they're going to take Brock Bowers. And I want to be clear, I wouldn't have hated on that at all because I think that highly of Brock Bowers. And then they didn't do it. They took Olu Fashanu, the left tackle out of Penn State. This is what I thought they should have done. I didn't expect them to do it. So let's start here. Were you surprised that they went with Fashanu instead of Bowers?
Yeah, there was a time during the pre-draft process where I would have been surprised if the Jets went offensive tackle. And that was after they signed Terrion Smith and traded for Morgan Moses. I feel like the last few days before the draft, for me at least, proved to be rather calming because what I decided to do was I didn't watch a ton of tape, hour upon hour upon hour of tape in the final 3 to 4 days before the draft. Instead, I said, I think I've done the work here. It's time to execute. And it's time to just sort of take everything that's been mentioned to you or that you've read or that you've said yourself and compartmentalize what's clutter and then what's common sense. And I kept coming back to the idea that the Jets last year, as we all know, had 4 snaps before Aaron Rodgers went down, in part because of pressure against the Buffalo Bills on Monday Night Football in Week 1. Last season, two whole teams had the same starting 5 offensive line combination from wire to wire. It was Buffalo and it was Cincinnati. That's great fortune. They also have good players there, but that's very rare. The Jets had 12 different starting offensive line combinations, and they had 16 combinations last year that played 10 or more snaps together. The story of the Jets season was Aaron Rodgers' injury. Sort of the footnote or maybe the subtitle was the offensive line was trash and it could not stay healthy. So while Terrion Smith and Morgan Moses on paper gives the Jets a fully complete offensive line along with John Simpson, the guard they signed from the Ravens, It's not going to stay that way throughout the season. It just
Yeah.
won't. History tells us that's not going to be the case. So I was glad the Jets did good business by moving down one pick, and then also did the logical thing by taking an offensive tackle.
Yeah, especially given, of course, that Tyron Smith hasn't played a full season in 7, 8, 9 years, maybe.
It's
I
been
mean,
a long time.
long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Fantastic player when he's healthy. We're gonna get to sort of the Jets offense and the skill players, and which is part of why I felt like they didn't have to go Bowers, and the player they did take, the wide receiver they did take. But really quickly on Fashanu, I was confused a little bit in the pre-draft process when it seemed like he was falling in a lot of mocks, and you're hearing reports of all of these other tackles going before him. I don't consider myself a great evaluator of offensive tackle play, so I want to start there. But watching him at Penn State, he looked pretty damn good. He
Yeah.
looked really polished. He's super. I mean, clearly the size and athleticism threshold are there. I thought he was a stout run blocker as well, which is really significant for a team that really could not block the for Brees Hall last year. I know that and this might be why he fell. A couple of some testing stuff. There's questions about his ability to handle power, and I get that, but I kind of think that's something he can get better at in the NFL.
Yeah, I like to break down every time you're evaluating a player, the coachable versus the uncoachable traits. And coachable also means like, I guess, developable. I'll make up a word there. And like you can get stronger, believe it or not, in the NFL. I think one of the realities for Olu, and this is both a testament to him and maybe sort of a discredit to like the draft industry, is that when you're coming from a very high perch, right? Like going into last season, there was the idea that Olu could be a top 5 pick, which he slid a little bit, I mean, down to 11, but it's not like going from 5 to 11 is some drop, like he didn't like fall into the Grand Canyon, right? It's just a small drop. And so I feel like it's held in such a high regard going into the year that anything he did wrong was going to be probably overanalyzed. His 2023 season probably wasn't quite at the same level as the 2022 season, but I also think when you're regarded at that level, one or two bad moments can be held against you in a notable way. The people that were anti JC Latham, and I don't mean anti JC Latham as in he shouldn't have been a first round pick, but there were some who felt like a top 10 selection was rather rich, was in part because there was one play against Michigan where it looked like Latham was just deer in headlights and Jalen Milroe is sacked, and it feels like it's kind of all on him. And for Olu Fashanu, like, the Ohio State game this past year, there were a couple of pressures late in the game where JT Tuamoloau, sorry if I mispronounced that, he's going to be in the 2025 NFL draft. He could have been in the 2024 NFL draft, kind of got the best of Olu. And I feel like every time I heard an anti-Olu argument, it was, well, the Ohio State game kind of
Yeah.
showed that he can be beat as a pass protector. So I think when you're breaking ties at the top, you end up using small things that may or may not necessarily matter when you're examining it in like a much bigger picture evaluation.
Your first pick, we're going to move back up. This is a pick we talked a little bit about on Monday, but it is worth talking about twice because it is so sick.
Yeah.
At pick number 9, the Chicago Bears take Rome Odunze. I've obviously talked about Odunze a lot on this show. Incredible player. What did you love the most about Chicago getting him at 9?
That the Bears could have justifiably gone a different direction and decided to just take the player that helps make their young quarterback better. And that's, of course, Rome Odunze. They could have taken Byron Murphy II, who ended up with your Seahawks, and of course is a great player. And they could have taken Dallas Turner, who ends up going 17th to the Vikings. Both would have been very reasonable. We're checking boxes of important spots along our roster. But instead, they said, let's take the best player on the board. And well, it's possible, maybe even likely, that Rome Odunze has the third most catches amongst Bears wide receivers this upcoming year. He's a star. He is a star in the making, or he will be a star at the NFL level. And Keenan Allen, I think, recently turned 32 or 33 years old. Like, I'm excited about the trade. I thought it was a really good piece of business for Chicago. But if you still have Keenan Allen on the roster 3 years from now, like, that might be more like unlikely than it is likely given his age. So you are both helping your offense now, perhaps in a more complementary role for Rome Odunze, but you might legitimately have a pillar of your offense for the next decade. And Mina, we've seen so many examples, and we don't have to relitigate all of them around the NFL of teams just not doing enough to invest in their young quarterback. And I think one of the common threads amongst the very best quarterbacks in the NFL is they're all in environments where, regardless of how good it has been, the team continues to just ensure that it never falls below a certain standard. KC might be sort of a bad example in the sense that their offense was not great last year, but they have continued to swing after trading away Tyreek Hill. There's been legit investments, right? The trade for Kadarius Toney and taking Rashee Rice last year in the second round and Sky Moore the year before that, and now Xavier Worthy. So maybe Chicago felt going into the draft that if they didn't get Rome Odunze, the offense would still be fine. But adding Rome Odunze makes it that much better. And when you can get the sixth player on my board with the ninth overall pick, that's pretty good value.
Yeah, I think you're right. There could be a case. There's still needs on this Bears team. The defensive line, I would say, edge opposite Sweat. You mentioned they could have taken Murphy in the middle. I know they like Braxton Jones. They could have gone left tackle though. But Odunze to me was just such a sure thing. We've talked about all the offseason, his unbelievably high floor. And I think also the value you get of having that sort of receiver on a rookie deal for 4 years is remarkable, to say nothing of what he does for Caleb, which you alluded to. The way I'll put it is this: watching the Huskies, I'm a Huskies fan, all season long, watching the experience I had as a fan was, you're like, what does your eye go to first when you're watching an offense? Okay, you're watching the pressures, you're seeing if they're blitzing, you're trying to see where's the quarterback, whatever, or how quickly, what's his drop, was he getting the ball, whatever. The first thing I would look for as a Huskies fan is, does Rome Odunze have a one-on-one? Because if he had a one-on-one,
It was
the
over.
football was going to him.
Yeah.
And if the football went to him, he caught the football. Over
He did have
70% contested catch rate.
Yeah, he had 24 contested catches last season, which was tied with Luke McCaffrey for the most in FBS. Credit to Luke, who ended up going 100th overall to the Commanders, the last pick of the third round. But you're right. And, I think people sometimes get sick of hearing analysis to this effect. So I'll try to be a little bit limited when I say these sorts of things right now. But when you're investing, and I understand that the world of NIL has made the amount of money these guys are making a little bit different. Many of these players have, hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of dollars to their names already. But the ninth overall pick in the draft is going to be making probably, $25, $28 million in his rookie contract. I don't know the specifics. I'm sorry if that was off by like $3 or $4 million, but a lot of money. You're handing over a fully guaranteed check, Mina. You better make sure that person's someone you can count on. And I really believe you'd be hard pressed to find a more universally respected person in the pre-draft process amongst the prospects than Rome Odunze. I mean, he is squeaky clean would be the understatement of the lifetime here. He is an incredible guy who I'm sure many of the stories following that Huskies program so closely, but it was like every time the debate amongst these top three wide receivers came up, like one of the points mentioned, if you're going to make the Rome Odunze case, was you're getting an all-time good dude as well.
All right. So I'm going to discuss these next two picks together because one of them was mine, one of them was yours. One was a first rounder, one was a second rounder, but they're both on the same team. They're both in the same position group. I can't remember actually who had who. I think I had Terrion Arnold and you had, Ennis Rakestraw.
Yep.
Both cornerbacks, both taken by Detroit, who traded up for Terrion Arnold to get to 24 from 29, giving up a third rounder in the process. I think everybody was pretty fine with that, given the caliber of the player. And it's kind of funny, Field, to think about it because last year the Lions got a lot of raised eyebrows for defying positional value, and and in this case, this is not about positional value. I think both people or everyone agrees cornerbacks fine there. But there is a through line between the two drafts because last year, even though the positional value wasn't there, the need was there. They needed The players that they added were at positions that they needed: running back, linebacker, tight end,
Yep.
and Brian Branch, nickel
Yep.
slash safety. So the Lions came into this draft, I think, with probably one of the more glaring and obvious needs of any team drafting, which was they needed to fix their pass defense. They needed to add cornerbacks in particular. Not only did they add cornerbacks, they double dipped at the position, and I think we both agree took corners that were unbelievable values at where they took them, even accounting for the trade. And I feel are perfect fits for the identity of the defense and the scheme that Aaron Glenn wants to run.
They're both Lions. They're both quintessential Lions. I want to look backwards for 1 second before we look forwards here. Last year, the Lions, as you just referenced, they took those 2 picks in the first round that defied positional value in some ways, but they had an opportunity to take Christian Gonzalez with the 6th
Yeah.
overall pick in the draft. Devin Witherspoon went 5th, and it was obviously a masterstroke by your Seahawks, and he was a great player. Sorry if Cisco, my dog, just came over and said hello. He wants to say what's up to Lenny. But Witherspoon last year going 5, I think was a bit of a surprise to the Lions, who I think would have taken him at number 6. I think they really would have. Christian Gonzalez, who, in retrospect, even with a small sample size in his rookie season, probably would have been worth every bit of a top 5 or 6 pick, ends up going 17th, I think it was, or 14th. But the Lions pass on Gonzalez, and it's part because like the brand of football that Christian Gonzalez plays. I mean, he is a long, speedy, fluid cover corner, and the Lions, are looking for like a bit more dog in their corners, right? They want guys who are just as likely to come up and blow up a wide receiver screen at the line of scrimmage as they are to play like silky smooth man coverage. And rather than getting one of those, they got 2 in Terrion, Arnold, and Ennis Rakestraw. Rakestraw was the 32nd player on my board, Mina. So going 61, at least in my eyes, is a very good value. There's a reason why he went 61. And in my conversation since the draft, general consensus is that, the lack of speed was going to be the big detriment to his round 1 case, and ended up costing him almost into the 3rd round. But I don't know. I felt like when I watched both those guys on tape, they could both scoot, and maybe I'm going to look back at this evaluation differently at the end of this upcoming season. But the speed was not the deficiency on tape in my eyes that it would suggest based off of where they both ended up going relative to mock draft forecasts. But both of these players should or could start right away.
Yeah. I went back and looked at my notes for both of them, and there was really like some of the same words were appearing.
Right.
Both can press.
Yeah.
Both blow up screens, you alluded to. Both arrive downhill in a hurry. Both can tackle.
Yeah.
Tackling. Yeah. And you mentioned just like starting right away. So that's another thing I think I just keep coming back to. Aaron Glenn, their defensive coordinator. So it comes from New Orleans. You remember they play a lot of man at the jump, but they don't really have the personnel to do it. And last year you saw him dial that back, I think, in large part because of the deficiencies they had in the secondary. These are 2 corners where I think because of their ability to both play press man, I wouldn't be surprised to see that dial crank back up for him to run sort of the defense that he wants to. I'll be very curious, Field, to see who plays where and how much, because they do have an excellent nickel. Brian Branch was a massive success for them last year. Arnold is someone who has inside-outside versatility. You saw that in college. I think, and Rakestraw, there were questions as well. I think with Branch, it'll be like, okay, well, maybe Branch is the primary nickel, but if they play big nickel or dime packages, maybe you'll see 2 of these guys on the inside. I'm very curious to see how they're deployed, but at minimum, Aaron Glenn has some really fun pieces to work with.
Yeah, versatility is way better this year. And obviously the reason why Cam Sutton was released was because of the legal matter that I believe he's currently still embroiled in. I have not checked the latest on that recently. Yeah, he is not on the team anymore as a result of that. But that was a signing that, there were moments, but I really felt like that team, like they really wanted last year, I thought, to have a guy that could legitimately shadow opposing number 1 wide receivers. And Cam Sutton was often tabbed to be that guy, Mina, but it just wasn't quite a perfect fit. I'm not sure if either of Arnold or Rakestraw will be used in that capacity, but while you mentioned how Glenn had to kind of adopt this philosophy of like less man, more zone at the beginning of his Detroit tenure, I think at his guts, at his core, he still wants to be somebody that can put players on islands, kind of harkens back to his own career as a very good corner in his own right. As an aside, Laura Rutledge and I flew back together from Indianapolis to, we both live here, we both fly in and out of Hartford because we live in the area. And we were flying through Detroit, and we sat together, and we're a few rows away from Aaron Glenn. And I've never seen a more impressive performance of somebody being so dialed into one thing for an entire flight. Start to finish, the man was glued on the tape. I was impressed. I am now going to, my own mind, imagine that he was just watching exclusively Alabama and Missouri tape for that entire flight.
It's a funny, like which defensive corner is watching tape, which defensive corner is watching like anything but you on they also traded for Carlton Davis, which
yes, they did. Yep.
Man corner. So
that will help the man corner a lot.
It'll be very different.
Yep.
Okay. One more pick in the first round that you loved, and I love that you chose this one because I haven't talked about it at all.
Yeah, I'm actually going through my whole list to make sure I get. Okay, yes, okay. Graham Barton, thank you. You know what's funny is so Graham Barton, guard, center, tackle, I suppose as well, from Duke, going to the Bucks, number 26 overall. And I had somebody from Tampa say, "What'd you know?" I got this text recently. I'm like, "What are you talking about?" Apparently, I had Graham Barton in my first mock of the year to the Bucks going 26th, and I was like, "Listen, man, I wish I could take that kind of credit, but the reality of this job is like so much of this is just getting lucky here." But it is such a Tampa pick. Barton, I thought had a case to be the best run blocking offensive lineman in the entire draft. But if you look at the Bucks, part of the reason why I felt good about it at the time in the first mock is, and I thought he would go higher, but truth be told, by the time we got to the actual draft, is if you go look at the entire Bucks offensive linemen, save for like, I think Tristan Wirfs, pretty much the rest of them are guys who were college offensive tackles that are now playing a different spot. Robert Haynes, their starting center, at least last season, was a college right tackle at Notre Dame who never snapped until the Senior Bowl. Like literally the week of the Senior Bowl was the first time he had snapped a football, and now he's an NFL center. Cody Mock, their left guard, a guy who played kind of all over the place in college, but finished up his North Dakota State career as a left tackle. Luka Decky, college tackle as well. Like they've turned good athletes at the tackle spot into great athletes at the interior offensive line spots. Graham Barton does have a background. He was a center in 2020 for Duke, so this is not totally new for him. But between the player value and just the team archetype, I felt like it was a great value at number 26.
Yeah, I really should have spent more time focusing on interior offensive line for Tampa because it was a really glaring need. They tackle position, they're set. Honestly, one of the real like unheralded coaching changes in the NFL, Luka Gedecki, right, is his name, really struggled on the interior his rookie season, and then I thought took a huge leap after they kicked him outside tackle, which was
much more natural spot for him. Yep.
Did not think that would work. It worked great, but the interior was a problem, and a big part of the reason why this team couldn't run the ball for crap last year. It was really tough sledding for Rachaad White. This instantly, to your point, upgrades the run blocking in particular on the interior, which I think is going to be massively helpful for them. He was a kind of a draft darling of a lot of people who really like offensive line play, who I respect. I think in large part because of his athleticism, tested amazing, and then the versatility that you allude to. So I think this is going to be another one of those classic Bucks offensive line picks that works out. And yeah, I really like that for them. Okay,
they do it really well in the draft. Like I just have a lot of respect for the Bucks process. They just generally speaking do like maybe not the sexiest things in the draft, but have done some really solid things and just like finding good values at less spots that generate less fanfare, but are nonetheless very important to winning.
Jalen McMillan, too, later in the draft they got was one that flew under the radar.
He was almost named to this list, but I will tell you why he wasn't when I discuss another pick of mine a little bit.
So many Huskies. Before we get to that, I am going to do my obligatory nod to the Eagles because I have to think some Eagles fans were probably listening on Monday and were like, how are you not mentioning the Eagles draft? Yeah. And I swear it wasn't a zag because there's some debate now over whether Howie Roseman is overpraised for his drafts. I don't know if you saw any of that discourse.
Oh, yeah. I hear it from the league as well sometimes, meaning people in the league. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, but Jalen Carter was awesome last year. Like, what are we doing? Like,
a piece of business. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's be real. But anyways, that said, we talked about the Lions going corner, the Eagles and double dipping and getting corners who are perfect for their scheme. The Eagles kind of do the same thing, right? Like they're kind of like the flip side, very different defensive schemes. Both, I think, got very, very good players. Again, two very good players. We could be talking about Quinyon Mitchell, but the player that I'm focusing on here is Cooper DeJean, large part because of value, falling to pick 60, when a lot of people, myself included, view him as a first round pick. Him and Mitch, it really is similar field to what we were saying about Arnold and Rakestraw.
Yep.
Him and Mitchell are like hand and glove for Vic Fangio. Two corners who, both primarily play off. Both Mitchell played a lot of off man. Cooper played more zone in college, but I think in terms of what Vic Fangio wants his corners to do, the route recognition, the use of disguise on the back end, versatility, but in a different way. Like we were talking about the Lions versatility, I meant more like playing inside outside, which matters, of course. But with Fangio, there's so much disguise on the back end, and you get two corners, I think, in Mitchell and DeJean, who are both extremely good at capable of that and will help them run that. But perhaps most importantly, just injects the secondary with speed and ball production, which was just so sorely missing last year.
They needed speed so desperately in the back end, Mina. I mean, you'd think it would show up in training camp practices because they have Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, but apparently it didn't. But the fall off last year for the Eagles defense was, I mean, it was discussed ad nauseum. The Eagles are always a popularly discussed team. And when you're 10-1 to start and then you fall off like they did, of course, it's going to be touched on nearly every single show. But man, it's like you still think back to it and you're like, how on earth did they make it to 10-1? And how on earth did this secondary take such a different shape within, really like the course of 5 months? But they desperately needed speed. And I was stunned that Quinyon Mitchell lasted to pick number 22. I guess the part that I'm having the hardest time figuring out is just like why he wouldn't have gone a little bit sooner here, Mina. Like I would have thought the floor for Quinyon Mitchell was 17, which was Jacksonville, at least initially, before they traded back to 23 with Minnesota, who wanted to take Dallas Turner. But it's like, okay, so really good college player, albeit at a small school, but kind of aces the pre-draft process, great Senior Bowl week, goes to the combine, runs 4.33. Like everything that he could have done, he did. And he didn't go until 22. Like that part was surprising to me. But two really, really good fits for Philadelphia, and two guys who perhaps as soon as 2025, maybe even 2024, should be their two outside corner starters. And by the way, and I know this for a fact because I recall multiple times we were out a couple nights together at the combine in February, and we were talking about a lot of different players, a lot of different people, but I would be surprised if anybody came up more in the conversations that you and I were both involved with than Cooper. He was your guy. He's been your guy throughout the pre-draft process. Just like, I don't care where you play him, what you ask him to do, he's going to produce. So the fact that 3 months later, or 2 months later, whatever it was, he goes to Philadelphia, this is not simply, like whatever Eagles bias or trying to, prop up the great work that Howie has done. Like I understand it rubs some people the wrong way because it's discussed so often, but the man knows how to do football business.
Yeah, the criticism I saw him get is, well, he just takes players people have heard of. Well, yeah, I mean
that's worked out pretty well.
We like them; they're players we like. I don't know. I think for DeJean in particular, really fascinated because I think we assume Mitchell very obviously profiles starting on the outside. I wouldn't be surprised if he actually competes with Bradbury day one, to be honest. DeJean is interesting, can play a lot of positions. Want to pose a quick question to you before we move on to your second round pick. Yep. So thinking about Vic Fangio and some of the defenses he's coached over the years, do you think DeJean has the tools to play sort of that Jalen Ramsey star position where he moves around, you get him on the ball, you move him inside on certain passing downs day one?
Absolutely. Without question. All right. So Cooper DeJean, and by the way, I always think about a Vic Fangio defense and there are a lot of different tentacles to it, but I always think more than anything, Vic Fangio wants to cut your explosive plays in half. Like nothing gets behind our safeties. If we can't do a good job of keeping everything in front of us, then we're not going to succeed. So I think they will be much better in that regard in Philly this season. But I thought Cooper DeJean was as comfortable in man-to-man coverage. I thought Kamari Lassiter, I'm not saying these guys are necessarily the best in the class at it, but they certainly seem the most comfortable, and they're on the short list for the best. But those two guys, fearless, like completely fearless. And there's good competition in the Big Ten, right? Like, I understand that the Big Ten is probably not as prolific of an offensive conference as the SEC is, but I thought Lassiter and Cooper DeJean completely unafraid every single weekend, regardless of who they were facing off against. I'll throw Max Melton, second round pick of the Arizona Cardinals, into that conversation as well, as a guy who just like loved the smoke, so to speak. But Coop has got really good man-to-man skills, awesome instincts. He's physical. He doesn't have amazing length. He's not a huge guy, but enough length to get up in your face and disrupt your route stem just a little bit. And the ball skills are great as well. If you give him an opportunity, he's going to make the most of it, which inherently deters quarterbacks from looking his way quite as often. So I have optimism that Coop will be, used a lot soon. And if he's starting day one, certainly wouldn't surprise me a little bit.
All right. Speaking of guys who we think can start day one, your next pick at second round, the 37th pick, the New England Patriots took another Mina Kimes Show favorite, Washington Huskies receiver, Ja'Lynn Polk. So talked a lot about how I love Polk and his profile. Big frame, amazing hands, Jacoby Myers type skill set.
Yes.
I think you and I both love him. Here's my question for you. If you're a Pats fan, are you disappointed that you didn't get one of the super fast guys? Because that's of course been an issue with this team, the lack of downfield separation. Obviously you draft Tyquan Thornton. That's not really panned out the way maybe you would hope in terms of the upside. How do you feel about Polk when you look at him through the lens of this team's needs?
Yeah, so the weekend before the draft, they asked me to do a piece on teams that you thought could trade up or down in the order, and I went through all the obvious candidates. But the last note that I made on trade up candidates, Mina, was I thought there was a chance that New England and Carolina, 33 and 34, might be sort of jockeying for position at the end of the first round. In my eyes, then there was six. I'll make sure I'm counting this right. I believe there were six wide receivers that I had as size, speed combination players that I thought had a real chance to go in round one. The three at the very top, obviously. And then beyond that, Brian Thomas Jr., Xavier Legette, and I thought Adonai Mitchell would also fall into that category. Obviously, he fell to 45. That's about things beyond the football player that he is. It turned out both New England and Carolina were trying to get back into the end of first round. Carolina successfully did so. The Patriots were not successful in their efforts to get up to 32. I don't know who they take. They might have taken, who knows? I mean, they could have tried to trade up to 32 to take Keon Coleman. I don't know the answer to that. I just, there was reporting that from Mike Reese that was one of the things that they tried to accomplish. But that being said, do I think that a little more speed would have been preferred for the Patriots' first wide receiver investment? I would have preferred that. But that being said, every year during the draft cycle, I'm going to learn this more and more as I go through it. You got to pick your guys. You got to pick your players that regardless of where they end up, regardless of what the world is saying about them as players, you love them, that you're going to put your chips in the middle of the table for those players. And I try not to do the guys that are going in the first round. Well, I would love to tell you that I'm a Malik Neighbors guy. So is everybody else that's watched Malik Neighbors, right? But my guy, the captain of the team this year for me was Ja'Lynn Polk. And so I will just offer just a brief scouting report beyond what you've already discussed. I keep using this analogy, which is that he is like an NBA low post player when they actually post it up in the NBA, right? It's not sizzle. It's not flash. He just gets buckets, right? You said he's got these incredible hands. Throw the football his direction. It's not going to be these Odell Beckham Jr. 2-finger catches, but it's going to be contested catches. It's going to be tight window throws. It's going to be throws on his back hip where he leans just a little bit backwards to make the catch, and toughness. So do the Patriots still need to add a little bit more speed at some point to this roster? They do, but I love Ja'Lynn Polk, and I got to figure that Drake May is going to develop a quick implicit trust in him.
Yeah. Two things I love about this pick. One is what you just said at the end, which is the pairing with Drake May, because Drake May
He's going to
loves
throw it.
giving, yeah, he's gonna throw it.
He
He
can throw it, that's for
loves
sure.
giving his receivers chances, and Jalen Polk is better than the receivers he played with his final year. In fact, he's a little bit more like Downs. They're not the same, but
Yep.
in terms of a guy who catches everything in college. So I love that. And then I love the fact that they took him in conjunction with the guy that they took later in the draft,
Yep.
Javon Baker, the UCF receiver,
Yep.
because he is kind of everything Polk isn't. Like Polk is the high floor guy with questions about the ceiling. Baker, 6'1", super fast, wins in the air as well. Can pardon me, stack corners with ease. He is the guy with the high ceiling and the lower floor.
Yep.
So Field, I almost look at it like how Green Bay just took multiple shots at receiver, not in the first round, and we've seen a lot of them. Some of them have worked out. Some of them have worked out at different times. To me, that's sort of how New England approached this draft at a position that they were so obviously in need of augmenting. So I like what he did for May. It does for May, and I like that they took them together. It feels like a plan.
7 out of 8 picks for the Patriots. It's year one offense. The one being one exception was Marcellus Dial, a corner from South Carolina in the 6th round. So, everything until the second to last round was on offense for the Patriots. So clear the focus for New England is going to be surrounding Drake May with competent pieces. So they've got work to do still, Mina. But you and I are obviously we're big Drake May fans. So that alone gives them some promise. But I did think the double dip at wide receiver was also very useful for them.
So we got a couple third rounders and then a fourth rounder to get through. I'll be quick on my third rounder because I'm not going to pretend again that I'm like this great evaluator of offensive line play. But I absolutely loved the Seahawks getting Christian Haynes out of UConn.
One of my guys as well. Yeah.
So you can tell me in with an intelligent viewpoint of why you like him. I'll just say this: like I watched. Our buddy Nate Dice, a few people, Brandon Thorne, who's I really trusted judgment. You don't think offensive line highlights are a thing until you see Christian Haynes absolutely ragdolling a nose tackle from the guard position. And I was just devouring clips of this dude just wrecking interior defensive linemen. Pardon me. Just a level of physicality, play strength, nastiness that has been missing on the inside. This was a huge, huge need for Seattle, the interior of the offensive line. It's why I thought they might go guard instead of Byron Murphy II, who I love that pick.
Yeah.
But, last season, there were a lot of questions about kind of some of Geno's struggles in the second half of the season in particular, but just throughout the season at times. And again, let me tell you, a lot of it was interior pressure coming immediately. Also the right tackle position. So the Seahawks, to their credit, Damian Lewis walks. They don't want to pay him what the Panthers paid him. Really big investment now in that particular area of need. So you're looking at Charles Cross on the left side, Laken Tomlinson, who they signed, who's a competent guard. Olu Tommy, who's the Michigan center, is probably going to start, but they add Nick Harris from Cleveland. And now you got Haynes, who I believe will start. You have Anthony Bradford, who has starting experience. Hopefully Abe Lucas is healthy. George Fant. I feel a lot better about this offensive line than I did at the end of the season.
You know how people say respectfully or like no offense, and then they actually don't show respect or they do offend somebody? I'm going to say respectfully and actually mean it when I'm talking about Christian Haynes respectfully. He was the biggest jerk in the class. I mean, he was just... defensive players hated playing against him. He was the classic play to the whistle, make you earn every single inch against him. He was going to, if he had a chance to drive you into the ground, he was going to do it. And UConn's not a dominant football program except for the 4 years that Dan was there. But this is a team that needed him to be great to have any chance to pop some big runs. And the competition wasn't always great, but they had a game against Tennessee, big game for them down in Knoxville this past season. And you watch Christian Haynes and you go, yeah, that looks good against high-level competition. And good length. He's a wrestler. He was a wrestler in high school. He's from Maryland, so he's got some of that scrappiness, I think, inherent to that sport that translates on the football field. Tons of experience as well. Was in college for 6 seasons, started for 4+ years. They actually canceled the 2020 year in Connecticut because of COVID. So he's got, I think the transition for him will be a little bit less stark relative to some of these greener prospects, but I had him higher than that on the big board. I think he was 54 on the final big board was Christian Haynes. So getting him at 71, I thought was a good value for Seattle and one of my favorite players to watch as well.
Okay, so staying in the division again, this is sort of
Yep.
the inverse of that because
Yep.
this is a huge need for the Los Angeles Rams, and this is I'm excited to hear you talk about this player because I think they gave up a lot to get him,
It did. Yeah.
which means they must have really loved him.
Yeah, they gave up. The Rams moved up from 51 to 39, which included obviously 51 plus a 2025 second round pick plus more to land Braden Fiske, who in a slightly different scenario, Mina could have easily been he could have been in the first 32 picks, could have been a first round pick. From the last 5 games of his Florida State season on, it's been a borderline perfect process for Braden Fiske. He had 6 sacks in his last 5 games, including 3 against in the ACC championship game against Louisville. Goes to the Senior Bowl, was unblockable. Goes to the combine, runs the fastest 40 of the defensive tackles, and has great quickness and just crushes the athletic testing portion. He's got a ton of experience. A 6-year college player, played at Western Michigan prior to Florida State. And the Rams had a dramatic need along the front 7, obviously with the Aaron Donald retirement. But even beyond that, they needed edge rushers. So I think in some ways this is about the player, and I do love Braden Fiske. If not for the fact that he's going to be 25 in January, he probably would have, I think he would have gone in the first round. But, the age is a consideration because if he makes it to the end of this current rookie contract, he'll be, if my math is correct, he'll be 28 going into free agency for the first time. Whereas, just for some context, Braylon Allen for the Jets will be, I think, 23 or 24 going into free agency for the first time. So there's just different, potential outcomes for guys based off of their age. But I really love the Rams' belief right now that they need to stay true to how they evaluate players and not become beholden to either sort of consensus ranks or thresholds. A word that you've used on this podcast, I think, is so important for people to understand in the scouting community. Is there are teams that will just say, like, hey, an offensive lineman with sub 33 and a half inch
Yeah.
arms, that's a red flag for us. Can we justify the pick? A wide receiver with a 4.6 or above 40, like, well, that's a tough one for us to get behind. The Rams are a little bit less worried about some of those things. Both their first 2 picks going to be old. Jared Verse will be 24 this season. Fiske already is 24 years old. You go into the third round. Cam Kinchins, third round pick out of Miami, ran a
I like that one.
4.65 40. I thought his tape was as good as any safety in the class meeting. Like just the tape, right? Which should be what matters a lot. Blake Corum, not even 5'8", whatever it was, 209 pounds, 4'5", 340. Like those are not the kind of metrics that you hear about a guy that usually goes in the first 78 picks at running back. And the Rams say, whatever, we think they're good football players that will help us win. And candidly, Mina, the way that they took care of the job last year and with all the drafting success they had last year, I'm sort of giving them not even the benefit of the doubt, but just like I'm trusting this is going to be a really good pick.
I like how him and Verse fit together
Yeah.
too as part of the plan. So they took Jared Verse with the 19th overall pick. They stuck teammates at FSU, and if you haven't watched the video where they like realize they're being drafted together, it's truly adorable stuff. But what's less adorable is what they did to offensive lines working in conjunction at FSU. They run games together. I think Fisk, you talked a little bit about the arm length being an issue, and he is an unbelievable athlete who proved as much at the combine. Go watch his 40. But he's a little bit vulnerable against the run versus very good against the run, very big, very strong. I think a little more questions about sort of the flexibility, the pass rush plan, but together it's like, oh, great. Yeah. Like this really works. I'm excited to see that play out again at the NFL level. And then obviously paired with Kobe Turner and Byron Young. This is a very young defensive line, but it's a lot of players that make a lot of sense for the Rams 3-4 scheme, I think. And yeah, it's going to be, I like what they're doing in terms of the core. There's obviously a lot of change there, not just with Aaron Donald moving on, but their very good defensive line coach, Eric Henderson's now moving to the college level. So this is going to be, they're asking a lot of young players because they're all going to play a lot. There's not a lot of veterans in the building in that front 7. And it is a team that I think should be competing as they did last year. They're ahead of schedule, so much will be at. This is, you and I were talking about these corners and whether what's their path to playing. These guys are going to play, so
Yeah.
they're going to be thrown into the fire. But I like the fact that they took players that I think can play from the jump.
Yep.
Okay, real quickly, because we are going kind of long. Staying in the NFC West for my pick, I loved Isaac Guerendo, the Louisville running back, going to San Francisco, 4th round. You told me to watch him, so that's why I know who he is. Field Yates was my source. He is. So I saw a tweet that I think captures his athletic profile, and I found it from Adam Leviton at Establish the Run. Oh, it's from Dane Brugler. Okay, so it's from Dane Brugler, who's amazing. Only 2 prospects in the last 20 years have weighed over 220 pounds and run a 4.33. One is DK Metcalf.
Of course.
The other is Isaac Guerendo. Nasty zone back. One cut. Explosive. Just, I feel like putting him in this Niners offense where he's obviously not the bell cow back. It just feels like rocket fuel.
There's only one reason why I'm nervous about this pick, because everything you just said is correct. It is, on paper, the perfect match of player and offense. The only reason why I'm nervous is the 49ers have lit mid-round running back picks on fire for like that last 5 years. And I'm like, don't let Isaac Guerendo become the next Joe Williams or Trey Sermon or you name it, or Terrion Davis-Price. No, I am optimistic about Guerendo. There is, I think him and Austin Booker, who ended up going to the 5th round of the Bears out of Kansas, were like the 2 players who I think had the fewest college starts. I actually don't know the answer to this, Mina. I tried to get the info from Wisconsin and Louisville, and I could not nail it down before the draft. And it's not important enough that I was going to waste a bunch of time on it. But I don't know that Guerendo ever started a game in college. Him and Jawar Jordan split carries last year, and obviously he was playing behind Braylon Allen at Wisconsin for a while. So I don't know that he ever started the game. And the tread is minimal, right? For a guy that was in college for 5 years, you're not worried about him coming to the NFL with this massive workload already underneath his belt. So Guerendo is such an intriguing guy for so many different reasons. And can't you just imagine, like at some point, one of these 49ers mid-round running back investments has got to hit. And it's going to be like, oh, Christian McCaffrey played 88% of the snaps in week 3 as opposed to 98% of the snaps in week 3. And Guerendo got 4 carries and they went for 47 yards and a touchdown.
And that's another reason why I love it. Christian McCaffrey's on the field so
Oh, my God. Man, he was playing 100% of the snaps in key. Remember that game against the Ravens, Monday Night Football? I think it might have been Christmas. He played 100% of the snaps, and they lost by like 3 touchdowns.
Got destroyed, And especially if they move on from Debo, who gets a few carries as well. Like this plan, okay, like we could bring in Pearsall, and he gets some carries because that's something he can do, and Guerendo. It just feels like there's like a bit of a succession plan in place. So we'll see, But when you look at him, it's not impossible to see Raheem Mostert. He's not the same player, but there is a little bit of a similarity. Okay, coming back, we're going to talk about some teams that we haven't gotten to and whether or not they did enough to help their quarterbacks.
Why should you bet with Caesars Sportsbook? 2 words: Caesars Rewards. Every bet brings you closer to the types of benefits only Caesars can offer: hotel stays, VIP experiences, sports and concert tickets, and more. It's not just an app, it's an empire.
Now is the time that we talk about Carolina. We're going to talk about a few teams. We're going to talk about Carolina, the Giants. Well, I won't spoil them all. We're going to start with the Panthers. So really quickly, just to kind of recap, because this isn't just the draft, this is everything. Did they do enough? These are the quarterbacks who so desperately needed help, and I don't think there's a quarterback who needed it more than Bryce Young coming into this season. Last year, he was in an absolute, trying to think of a word that doesn't contain profanity, horrible, horrible situation. I'll just say that. So they did a lot, starting with the offensive line. You're sticking with Ekwonu, left tackle, but pay the aforementioned Damian Lewis a ton of money. Robert Hunt gets this massive contract at guard. I think Austin Corbett's still going to be the center. Moton is the one good player on the offensive line. And you bring in Josh Nijman, by the way, so it's good depth.
Mr. versus
completely rebuild the wide receiver group. You trade for Deontay Johnson. You draft Xavier Leggett, who we talked about. So Adam Thielen is he's still going to get a lot of targets, but you do a lot of work there. A lot of the guys who you were leaning on last year then slide back. Draft Jatavian Sanders out of Texas at tight end. Tommy Tremble's the other tight end. And then you trade up to go get Jonathan Brooks, who I had as my RB1 in this class. Miles Sanders is still in the roster. We'll see what happens there. You have Chuba Hubbard. So that's the group now. Field, did they do enough?
I think they did as much as they could reasonably do in one offseason, Mina. I really believe that. I mean, they were hamstrung in a couple of ways. First of all, they had to offload some bad deals, right? They had to get rid of some money that was just sitting there collecting dust on that salary cap. Second of all, they didn't have a first-round pick until they traded up from 33 to 32. It's just a major detriment to a team that obviously could use instant impact playmakers. I don't know. I think I would feel strongly in my belief that Carolina has a lot of hope that Bryce Young will become the player that they invested the first overall pick in last year. I really think that is the internal mindset, is that it's achievable for Bryce. It just wasn't going to be achievable with what we had around him last season. But if it's not, Mina, at least we know, based off of what they have in place this year, that they gave Bryce a chance. So if this year, the players that they acquired for legitimate investments, right? 2 guards making at least, I think it was $152 million combined invested into Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis, right? And Xavier Legette, a trade up from 33 to 32, a first round wide receiver, right? Like, if there are not steps forward from Bryce this year, at least you can say, all right, we knew the problem in 2023 was the pieces around him. We weren't sure if Bryce was a problem at all. If it does not get better this year, then you might have to say to yourself, okay, like, we may need to begin the quarterback search, much as that may pain us to do 2 years into the number 1 overall pick's career. I think, Mina, that's definitely like the downside way of looking at it. I think Carolina really believes there's something special to be unearthed with Bryce Young, and I think there's a much better chance we get closer to that reality this year. You can't do everything in just one offseason, but I really believe this was a pretty strong effort to at least throw as much as they could into surrounding Bryce Young with some pieces to work with.
It's funny because I think when I think about it, like, the criticism you would have of the draft is kind of similar to the criticism you would have of how they approach free agency, which is, you could argue that both Brooks and Legette were overpays. Like the value is the criticism. Same with the guards that they signed.
Yeah.
However, because of the urgency of the need to upgrade to evaluate Bryce Young, and then the lack of capital, which you alluded to, they kind of had to do it, right, in both cases. And I do like the players, Legette and Brooks, and I like how they fit with the existing players on the roster. Deontay Johnson was one of my favorite moves of the entire offseason. I think he's, like, incredibly underrated. I know Steelers fans are, you know what, Steelers fans, I praised your draft, so relax. He's an elite separator, and separation was just basically MIA in Carolina. And then in Legette, you get a guy with true X receiver, number 1 upside, speed, and size. I think there's questions about route running ability, and I'll be curious to see how they use him. You know, they find ways to manufacture touches for him. I wouldn't be surprised if, I mean, it's funny because I think with him, like, the upside is like DK Metcalf. I saw him comped a little bit to Christian Watson as, like, and that made people nervous. But Christian Watson, when he's healthy, has become a really, really good player in Green Bay. They just kind of had to figure out how to use him, and he had to kind of get his sea legs underneath him as a pro. So I think that brings me to the last thing about Carolina, which I didn't mention, but is probably the most important of all when we talk about did they do enough, which is Dave Canales is the head coach. You know, one of the biggest problems last year, aside from the lack of separation, was apparently that, you know, just the proliferation of offensive voices. It seemed like a dream team at first, and then we realized, okay, no, you really need one voice with a vision for this, and Canales now is that voice, and he has had a lot of success working with quarterbacks over the last few years. I think the work he did, particularly last year in Tampa Bay, is probably why he is the head coach of the Carolina Panthers. So now it is incumbent upon him to get the most out of these players. But I think as far as hires go, I like that they went in that direction, because that's as important when we talk about did they do enough as any of the personnel changes that they've made.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting you bring up Dave Canales and his history with quarterbacks, because oftentimes when we're talking about coaches that have done great works with quarterbacks, it's like we point to guys and I don't think there's actually been someone that fits into this category with Lamar. So I'll just make it up. It's like, yeah, he worked with like Lamar Jackson, and before that he's with Peyton Manning, and before that he was with Joe Montana. And you're like, okay, yeah, like I would expect someone to have a pretty good looking resume if you've worked with like three, multi-time MVP quarterbacks, right? Like we're praising Dave for his work with Geno Smith, Baker Mayfield, who both are solid players, right? But like Geno was a backup for 8 years, and Baker was, traded, whatever it was, twice in like 7 months, or maybe it was traded and then released twice in a total of 7 months. So like Dave's done like legit work with players who had a much wider sort of range of outcomes when he was under their watch.
Fingers crossed. I went on Bomani Jones's podcast a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about Bryce, and he said his exact phrase, which killed me, was "Lil homie out there doing his best," and I was like, that is both so accurate and so also like,
Oh my God.
but we're all rooting for you, Bryce.
Yep.
Okay, so the Chargers. I praise their draft, but I do think it's worth taking a step back to ask whether they did enough, because this was a really, really I think the situation was much worse than people maybe appraised it, in part because the receivers that they had on their roster were constantly injured. So now you've got Quentin Johnson, first round draft pick last year, Josh Palmer, Ladd McConkey. Behind them, Darius Davis. They drafted Brendan Rice. There's, tight end. They remade their tight end room. Will Dissly and Hayden Hurst. Running back, also, this kind of flew under the radar, but they remade their running back room through free agency. They did not draft Blake Corum as people thought they might. You bring in J.K. Dobbins. Basically, the Ravens running backs are another running backs,
Yep.
including the Ravens' former offensive coordinator, Greg Roman.
Yep.
And then the offensive line now, really the strength of this team, crazy. Rashawn Slater, who I believe is going to stay on the left side from all the language coming out of there.
Seems to be the case. Yep.
Yeah. Zion Johnson, maybe Corey Linsley. This is quietly the real something to watch.
I think
Center.
he's going to retire. I think
Okay,
I think it'll be after June 1. It's for salary cap purposes.
So do you know who the Chargers center is?
Incumbent center. I believe they signed Bradley Bozeman to a 1-year deal. They did sign Bose. I don't know if it was. I think it was a 1-year deal. But yeah, that would be reasonable
expectation. So that is a question.
Yeah.
I think Jamari Salyer kicks inside.
Yep. Did a good job, by the way, filling in for Slater a couple of seasons ago.
Good player. And then Joe Alt on the right side. So Field. This is a really interesting rebuild, because it's just so philosophically different from where they've been, where I think maybe some wanted them to go. Do you feel they did enough to help Justin Herbert?
Okay, so I don't know that they did enough. If your question, or if the conceit of this is like, can they be competent contenders for the AFC West this year? My answer would be no. Jim Harbaugh has rules that he lives by in life. One of them is don't try to win every fight in the first round. And I felt like that played out this offseason, that regardless of the fact that we have a quarterback who is in his pre-prime years, but getting close to the prime of his career, we are not trying to just fix this thing all overnight, because I don't think right now, 1 to 53 or 1 to 90, I guess, is this roster a guarantee to be a whole lot better than it was last year, right? They lost. I mean, there were some legitimate pieces that were either let go or traded this offseason. But if the goal was to take the shape of a Jim Harbaugh team, they certainly have done that, right? I mean, the mark has been made here. I do wonder if like the temperament of the quarterback helps in this case, Mina, because don't you think if you were a quarterback who had Keenan Allen and Mike Williams and I guess Austin Eckler to a degree as well, even though he had a disappointing season last year, you'd be saying to yourself, like, can we just keep any of these guys? Like, can I at least keep Gerald Everett maybe?
Yeah.
I don't think Herbo's the kind of guy to raise his voice and cry foul about what's taken place this offseason. I think they've done enough to feel like they're on the Harbaugh treadmill, but I'm not convinced this team is going to compete for the playoffs this year.
Did you see Joe Alt say Herbert was like, I'm Justin Herbert, quarterback?
Yeah, so classic. So classic. I mean, you know more than I do, but that is so classic.
It is very classic. I think, so this kind of brought me back to, I think, an interesting question about the Chargers the last few years, which was this. Why doesn't Justin Herbert throw the ball downfield? And the truth is there's 3 reasons. One, lack of pass protection. To that end, I think they did a lot. Right. Clearly, that went into this with a desire to address the offensive line, and I think certainly the run game is going to look a lot better. Not just because of the offensive line, but because of the backs they brought in, who I like a lot, Greg Roman. But in terms of pushing the ball downfield, Justin Herbert often did not have time to push the ball downfield. The other two things are the weapons, the lack of a downfield threat, and then when Mike Williams was not in the lineup, it's often the case, and then the temperament of the quarterback, or his risk aversion. That, I think, is an open question here with the players that they've added. Because in Ladd McConkey, and I talked about this when I talked about how much I like the pick, I actually think they get a quarterback who has more juice downfield, or probably a receiver who has more juice downfield than he's given credit for. Sure. But, primarily he's going to be working underneath, which Herbert, we know, loves to work. Johnston is this huge question. Can he be better than the play? He was really
completely lost
last year. Yeah. And it wasn't a case of lack of opportunity, man, because those receivers were hurt. Yeah. And he was a first round draft pick. So I think that's, the question of, did they do enough? How do we view this offense? What is the potential for it? A lot of it will come down to, can you get more out of Quentin Johnston? Because in the perfect world where Quentin Johnston takes a leap and he has the sort of production we saw at TCU where, he's turning shallow crossers into massive gains, and he's amazing with the ball in his hands, and he's, beating cornerbacks downfield and separating, and he's this big body receiver. Awesome pairing with McConkey and Palmer. Yeah. But I don't know if he can be that guy in the NFL. So that's something that I'm very curious to see.
Yeah, and we'll see how long of a leash he has now under a new regime. Because if it doesn't happen this year, Mina, then I don't know. We don't the NBA is where we fire up the trade rumors probably a little bit too soon. The NFL, they don't take there's not quite as many of them in the NFL, but yeah, this is a make or break year for a guy who 1 year ago at this time we were talking about wow, Justin Herbert just landed a potential game-changing weapon to add to Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. So life does come at you fast in the NFL.
So speaking of Mike Williams, let's talk about the Jets.
All right.
Remade offensive line. We praised the drafting of Olu Fashanu, is how you say his name? Fashanu. Yeah, I've been saying Fashanu. But they had Tyron Smith, John Simpson, Morgan Moses. Inside, you got Tippmann and ABT, who were on the team last year. Tight end group now is Conklin, Jeremy Ruckert. That's kind of a question. Probably the weakest area in the team. We love this running back room. Breece Hall is amazing. You draft Braylon Allen too, so you get some depth there, young depth. Garrett Wilson is still your wide receiver run, but you bring in Mike Williams on a 1-year deal, and you draft Malachi Corley, who sort of Deebo Samuel light is how I would describe him.
The Yak King. Yep.
Yes. Field, I'll go first here, and then you still have Alan Lazard on the team. I think they did do enough.
Yeah.
I'm looking at this offense, and even if there's some injuries, Mike Williams has obviously an injury history. Tyron Smith, we alluded to. I think that this offense should be good enough, provided that the quarterback comes back fine from his Achilles injury. I'm looking at it, and I feel like they are optimized right now to win.
There are two things, in my opinion, that can prevent the Jets from being a really, really good team. One is Aaron Rodgers not being healthy, as we saw last year what happens there. Two is that there is an unquestioned amount of pressure on the entire organization. And if this team, remember, their schedule out of the gates last year was insanely difficult. If they get a comparably difficult draw the first month of the season or first 6 weeks of the season, and they're 2-4, can they dig themselves out of that hole early in the year amidst what will be massive, massive pressure? There's going to be pressure because there always is in the NFL for coaches, certain coaches. But I got to tell you, I don't know that I'd want to be a coach in a pressure situation in any year less than this year for this reason. Bill Belichick is just sitting there on the sidelines right now. And in the NFL, if you want to bring an interim coach in, Mina, there's no process. You could once the season's begun, if a team wants to fire their head coach and hire Big Bird as the head coach, they can do it. There's not just bring them in, right? At the end of the season, you have to go through a process. But Bill Belichick, who's going to be in a public-facing role this year with appearances on Pat McAfee show, and it sounds like will be maybe doing some other stuff as well. Like, I just feel like the pressure is going to be so significant for these coaches on the hot seat because of the fact that the greatest coach of all time is potentially just one phone call away.
And I guess that brings me to one aspect of the Jets offseason that I do think deserves criticism or questioning or maybe a little bit of a side eye as we talk about did they do enough. Hackett's back at offensive coordinator, and they don't have a choice because Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback, and I think the combination of him and Aaron Rodgers is very different from the combination of him and Zach Wilson / whoever. But if we are looking back at this Jets season and it doesn't work out offensively, which we're talking about, one would be injuries or Rodgers not being back at full strength. I think another possible reason will be they didn't upgrade at offensive coordinator. I think that is something that deserves a healthy dose of skepticism.
Been 2 straight years of uninspiring results for Nathaniel Hackett. I mean, we don't need to go back and live that 2022 Broncos season once again. But when you last 15 games as a head coach in what felt like, could be a dynamic situation for a quarterback and a coach to be in Denver, that's the kind of stuff that causes these sorts of, not narratives, but these sorts of conversations to take place.
So 2 more teams. The Arizona Cardinals. It's a fun one.
It is.
So a lot of changes, had a lot of draft capital to work with, and really applied it to this offense, an offense that I think surprised the whole team, surpassed expectations last year. So let's start there. But Kyler Murray comes back. I think he shows real flashes coming back from injury, the sort of flashes that made this team feel comfortable not taking a quarterback or even acquiring, we'll get to the player that they took at pick 4. Yeah. But, the flip side of the debate over Michael Penix Jr., which we're not going to have for the 10,000th time, but it really is a debate about, like, do you take a quarterback and take that shot on goal? How comfortable are you with current situation, opportunity cost, draft capital? Well, the Arizona Cardinals told us that they are comfortable because they did not take quarterback, unlike the Atlanta Falcons. So Kyler Murray is coming back. So what they did to surround him, you invest in the offensive line. You sign Jonah Williams in free agency, so he'll play left side. I believe Paris Johnson will play on the right side. Yep. Means that they're comfortable with their interior of the very unexpected Froholt at center, who is way better than anyone, myself included, thought he would be. You have Isaiah Adams, I think, at left guard, Will Anderson on the right side. The receiver group is now Harrison Jr., who they did stick and take at 4. Greg Dortch, I guess.
Chamber, yeah.
Michael Wilson over Greg Dortch, Zach Pascal, who was the highest paid receiver on the roster, and then Trey McBride, who is terrific, tight end. Yep. They draft Tip Ryman.
My favorite.
Yeah. Okay. And then you have James Conner, who was really sneaky good last year, and then you add super high upside running back in Trey Benson.
We love Trey.
Field. I guess this is different because with the Jets, we're coming of a team where you got to compete now. This, to me, did you do enough? Did the Arizona Cardinals do enough to be a playoff team? But rather, did they do enough in terms of like the rebuild, getting future pieces of the core in place?
Their depth is so much better now compared to where it was when Monty Ossenfort inherited this roster. I mean, it's like night and day. Like, you talked about a couple of players that now project as backups on that roster that are good players. Like, that to me is a sign of how far things have come for Arizona in the past, whatever it is, 15 months since Monty Ossenfort was hired. So you have to, I think, decide what lens you're going to view this team from and what way you're going to measure improvement this year. Arizona, to me, looks a lot better than where they were last season. Arizona also could be 4th in the division this year because San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle, all teams with winning records last season, who 2 out of the 3 of them made the playoffs. Like, that's a legit tough division they play in. It's going to take some time here for Arizona, but I was so impressed with the draft. They just kept checking boxes off of positional needs, players that fit the value, and, selfishly as a draft analyst, when guys that you're harping on get taken in about where you harped on them to get taken, you feel like it's a darn good draft. So I was a big fan of everything Arizona did over the weekend, and I feel like while it's probably a bit more meticulous than it is an overnight rebuild, they've come a long way in a short period of time. And for a team that had sort of like an up and down first few years with Kyler Murray. I mean, back-to-back years with top 10 picks, 10th and then first, like that means you were bad. And they were in Kyler's third season, 2021, the last undefeated team. Like they were up and down like for a 5 or 6 year stretch there. And now it feels like, well, they still might finish last in their division, Mina. Like now I think the vision is much more evident to me as compared to where it has been all too frequently over the past half dozen years.
Yeah, I look at this roster, and so I was pretty strong advocate of sticking and taking Harrison Jr.
Same.
He's so good, and now it's you run the offense through him, and McBride is excellent, but I can't help but look at it and think, damn, they're going to be good at running the football.
Yeah.
They already were pretty good last year. I talked about, I mean, they were really, really good in the second half of the season to the point where like they were running. You remember, I mean, the things James Conner and this offense did to teams like, I mean, the Eagles were obviously terrible run defense, but good Lord. I mean, They ran all over Seattle, another very bad run defense, but you really saw them establish an identity on the ground, which isn't surprising given that their offensive coordinator, Drew Petzing, came from Cleveland, which is, of course, very good running the football, but I think took a lot of people by surprise. And you throw in some of the players that they've added to that extent. Tip Ryman, Trey McBride is the passing game is going to go through him. Ryman's there to block.
Block his butt off. He will too. He's 6'4", 273 pounds, ran a 4.64 40, and absolutely mashes in the running game. He had 19 catches last year, Mina. 19, and he got drafted in the third round, which tells you
something. Yeah.
A, he can block his butt off, and B, Illinois needs to reevaluate how they use Tip Ryman if they ever get him back for an extra year of eligibility somehow.
So, and then the combination of Connor and Benson, I already know this team's going to run for like 200 yards on Seattle.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be, I mean,
Byron Murphy solves it all. We're all good.
Okay. Yeah. Fingers crossed. But the thunder lightning aspect of this is really, 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 I think, smart and really, really scary on the ground.
Yep.
So, I love Harrison Jr. and what that does, but they're going to run the ball, and they're going to run the ball well. So did they do enough not to be, a contender, but absolutely, I think, to continue moving, not just in the direction that they started, but also in terms of establishing an identity offensively.
I would agree.
Okay, let's finish with the New York Giants. So the question that we've been talking about is, did they do enough to help their quarterback? But before we get into what they did, I do want to address the quarterback, because there was a little rumor, it's a report. So
somewhere in between, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit of speculation. Friend of the show, Greg Rosenthal, tweeted, he was quoting Daniel Jeremiah, another friend of the show, who said, "I believe Drew Lock has a really good shot winning that job." They were comparing Daniel Jones and Drew Lock, emphasis on Drew Lock, to the quarterbacks that were going to be there at 6. So there's a reason why this is more than a bit of speculation. There's a couple of reasons. One, Seahawks GM John Schneider basically said as much in a humorous bit of instigation, but I mean, you're not making stuff up when he said that Drew wanted an opportunity to start. It's part of the reason why he ended in New York. Then Drew Lock had to say, "Oh no, it was conveyed to me that Daniel Jones is the starter."
I love the cleanup efforts of so good.
Conveyed to me. But the other reason why is the Giants didn't take a quarterback, right? Teams tell you what they're thinking, and that had to suggest either faith in Daniel Jones, or potentially they liked what they had on their roster in terms of the competition. And so let's start there. Like, do you believe that Drew Lock could take meaningful reps for New York this season?
Hey, at this point, there's too much smoke for me to ignore it, Mina. And the fact that Daniel Jones is still not fully healthy opens this door kind of implicitly. So I'm going to go with yes. And while Drew has been an uneven career, maybe I'm just totally misremembering each of their career arcs. But Daniel Jones has had more memorable, positive moments in his career, but I don't think he's like several laps ahead of Drew Lock in terms of memorable, positive moments in his career. Is that a fair or unfair characterization?
I mean, Drew Lock will always have that kind of it. Yeah. I think probably Giants fans would be screaming that Jones has had better games, and certainly the
Yes,
season
for sure.
before
Yeah,
last.
2022 was legit. I mean,
It was legit, but it deserved a healthy side eye, which is what made the contract so criticized
yep.
versus the tag decision because yes, he played better, but he was not pushing the ball downfield. It was a little bit of a bumper bowling offense for him. So, like he had moments, but with a lot of caveats. And Field, his contract, again, like it's not guaranteed next year. It's guaranteed for injury. Given all of the reporting, I mean, like that's the other thing about reading tea leaves is like I think Brian Dable would like to move on from being. I feel comfortable saying that based on some of the reporting coming out of New York. And I think it probably makes him very nervous that if Daniel Jones gets hurt while playing this year, they will be locked into him.
This is what happened with Robert Griffin III way back when fifth-year options were not fully guaranteed. Remember, Robert became a scout team safety for the Commanders. There was some conversation about whether this is what happened to Russell Wilson last year when he was benched. The Broncos say it was not simply that, but the potential for guaranteed money taking place or kicking in for 2024 was part of the conversation, no doubt. This is the delicate bounce you have when you're a head coach or you're a GM. Even if Daniel Jones is, I don't know, 10% better during the upcoming season than Drew Lock, is it a conversation? I mean, if he's 30% better, Mina, if it's like night and day, you probably just play him, right? But if it's close, these are the kind of debates that are going to rage within an NFL front office. It's fascinating. But I will say, regardless of who starts at quarterback for the Giants, I thought what they did at number 6 was the correct take. I thought it was the correct move. My big stance on the Giants and J.J. McCarthy specifically, because I thought he was the most likely bet at quarterback 4. I was wrong in that regard, but I didn't have conviction on J.J. McCarthy being a top 6 pick. He was 18th on the final big board, Mina. And if you're taking a quarterback in the top 10, you better have conviction. I did not. So in my opinion, the Giants were wise to instead take Malik Neighbors, who gives them something they haven't had in literally 6 years.
Well, and if J.J. McCarthy was the pick at 6, he would have walked into a very, very difficult
That would have been
situation,
dicey. Yep.
which is, of course, now a lot better because of the addition of Malik Neighbors. So to go back to sort of the question, did they do enough to help Jones? The wide receiver room, you got Malik Neighbors as your wide receiver 1. He is paired with Jalen Hyatt, Wan'Dale Robinson, Darius Slayton, who I think might have some contract issues. So we'll see how that.
Yeah, currently looking for a new deal. Yeah.
Okay. Isaiah Hodgins, Isaiah McKenzie, 2 Isaiahs.
Yeah.
And then I wrote Darren Waller question. He might be retiring or.
Yeah, it took Theo Johnson, 107th overall at a Penn State, very athletic tight end who could be the heir apparent. Yeah.
Cody Bellinger, who's Daniel Bellinger.
Daniel Bellinger, yeah.
The other whatever.
Yeah.
They did
both good athletes.
Invest heavily in the offensive line outside of course, Andrew Thomas, who's their standout left tackle. Now you've got Aaron Stinney, John Michael Schmitz, who's going to be a second-year player, John Runyon, and then Jermaine Illuminor or Evan Neal at right tackle. Saquon Barkley is out. Devin Singletary is in at running back.
Yeah.
I don't think this is enough.
I don't think it's enough either. I think it matters of like what you're comparing it to, right? If you're comparing it to the 2022 season when you win, I think they went 9-7-1, or 10-6-1. Do I think that's likely this year? I don't. But are they like at least moving slightly forward compared to where they were last year? Yes. So again, this is going to be kind of like this might be a little bit of a litmus test of what you view as achievable for New York.
I'll be very curious to see how Neighbors is utilized because like you, I'm very high.
A lot. Yeah.
Hopefully a lot. Yeah. Very high in the player. And look, I will say this. I think Brian Dable and Mike Kafka are smart. And I think they're very good offensive coaches. I think they did a lot with not a little that season that we alluded to. But that offense was very, I called it a bumper bowling offense. It was very like, QB runs, options, RPOs. They did not push the ball downfield very much. I think with Neighbors, you're going to see him in the slot a lot of motions, a lot of ways to spring him open this is not the coaching staff. And this is one reason why I do like the landing spot for him. They're not going to just like line him up outside and say, go in. This is not, they are much smarter than that. And I do think I will say this about Daniel Jones: he did not push the ball down the field very much last couple of years, but he can throw the ball downfield. He's got like a decent
He does.
arm. So, if they're able to find ways to get Malik Neighbors open, I do believe he can, and he can push it to him. So, while I don't think this group as a whole is good enough, I do think it is better, certainly better than last year. And if Jones, who's very erratic quarterback, can play the way he has in flashes, it could be fun to watch.
Yeah, no, it's. Yeah. Now I'm thinking back to some of the games with Tommy Cutlets last year, and I'm like, you know what? Compared to that, Mina, it'll be the greatest show on turf. No, this is it's a much on paper. There is many more glimmers of hope, and it's May, Mina. I like to be optimistic right now. I don't have the energy right now to just imagine like all the things that could go wrong for various teams. So I'm going to buy into the
Malik Neighbors is awesome.
possibility.
We love
Yeah.
Malik. He's such a cool player.
I don't care if Daniel
Yeah.
Jones has 4,000 yards in yak in his passing total next year. I think it's going to be better than where it was this past
100%.
year, and that gives me some optimism.
100%. I mean, it will. Giants fans, the experience you had watching Odell Beckham Jr. his first few years, you could
The
have
vibes
that,
there. Totally.
and with, by the way, limited quarterback play at that point too.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So yeah, it is. Love the pick. Love the player rather.
Yep.
So yeah, we'll see. So by the way, if you're listening to this and you're saying, well, my team has a rookie quarterback, I shouldn't be talking about whether they did enough. That's what we're doing next week. So Derek Class is
great.
joining the show. Yeah, to talk about the rookie quarterbacks, because there's so many of them were taken, and how the teams that took them might optimize their circumstances, both from play calling, personnel, all of that. I'm gonna have a lot of fun getting into that because, again, so many quarterbacks were taken.
Yeah.
As always, you can check out this show on youtube.com/@Mina Kimes. If you don't already subscribe, please do so. Put out a lot of content on there. Field, what are you going to be up to now that the draft is over?
I'm a little bit sick, Mina. On Tuesday night, I went back into my Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, and Shador Sanders notes and watched a little bit more of them. So right now, we are going to flip the switch to fantasy football heavily going forward. It'll be a lot of that over the next 8 months. But now that I've had a full run through on the draft, I feel like I can pace myself a lot better. So if I do some of the groundwork now on guys, that'll help me feel in January, February, March, April, not quite as rushed going into the actual draft in Green Bay. But I can't wait to start diving into the 2025 class. And then also looking at how these guys in 2024 end up performing this year in the field.
One thing I did promise a listener that I would do is bring back my off-season content recommendations, because I put out my friend Rachel Kong wrote this fabulous book. It's called Real Americans. If you guys like reading fiction, literary fiction, it is amazing. Go check it out. So I'll give one content. I didn't give you a warning about this, but a thing that you have been watching, listening to, reading, whatever that you have enjoyed. I will go first.
Okay.
This is a very obvious one, but X-Men 97 is unbelievable. Obviously, not obviously. I am a big X-Men fan, for people who have noticed my backdrop. And I swear this isn't like corporate synergy. Nobody told me to promote it. It is, but it is seriously, I wish my kid, who's screaming in the background right now, by the way, because he just woke up from his nap. I wish he was old enough to watch it, because it is it really is really for adult. I mean, I guess kids, it's good for kids and older kids, but it is so well written.
Yeah.
I cannot believe how well done it is. So you should check that out.
By the way, hello to your child. Love it. Love the interference from the kid. I also was looking back to see if I have this book up there in my bookshelf, and I do. And I know that people probably have seen the movie by now, but one of my favorite books that I've read in quite some time that I recently put down, Where the Crawdads Sing. I think I was probably like 2 or 3 years behind it, Mina, but what a great book that is right there. Have you
Yeah.
you've read it probably already? Okay.
I
So
actually haven't. I
Okay.
own it and I haven't read it.
Oh my
So,
God, it's so good.
yeah,
It's terrific. Yeah.
people love it.
I think there's a made for TV series, or is it a
Yes.
movie now? Is that Reese Witherspoon in it? I think it is,
I
right?
think she made it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. The book is just delightful. But yeah, so I would highly recommend.
Oh, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a series on TV that I would recommend. I'm definitely behind. I mean, I'm very behind on TV right now for two reasons. One, the draft, but two, we're in NBA/NHL playoffs right now. There's so much good sports every single night. Like last night, I was like, yeah, I might go to bed early. And then Knicks Sixers went completely bananas.
Getting to see who will be sacrificed to your Celtics next. Okay, well, I will check that out. Field, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, as always, to the amazing folks at Omaha Productions for making this show. Kirsten Sebecki, Owen Saylor, Anthony Jimenez, Jack Foster. As I said, you can check it out on YouTube. You can also listen to it ad-free on Amazon Music, or check it out wherever you get your pods. Otherwise, I'll be back next week to talk about those quarterbacks.